Hello, everyone. My name's Bill Linwood. I'm the Artistic Director for Aventa Ensemble in Victoria. It's my great pleasure to welcome percussionist extraordinaire and the Artistic Director of Array Music, David Schotzko. David and I are going to talk a little bit about a work from the Canadian composer Michael Osterly. It's called SpanningTree for percussion. We both play the work, we both love it, and we thought we'd just share some of our thoughts and ideas about it. And welcome, David. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. We spoke on the phone a couple of weeks ago. It's nice to see your face.
So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how this work came into being. I know it was commissioned by you, and was it Daniel Cooper?
Yeah, it was Daniel Cooper. So Daniel, if anyone, probably anyone in Toronto who's seeing this would probably remember Daniel. Daniel was an incredible supporter of contemporary music in Canada and especially in Toronto. He was hugely supportive of the local, of a lot of the contemporary music ensembles and composers in particular in Toronto. He was a big fan of composers. And he very much liked to commission works. And it really became, it was a passion of his. And he was just, he was a layperson, a very educated layperson, and just loved it. It was something that he was exactly the kind of supporter that we all dream of, honestly. He was so committed and so interested and so curious and just deeply interested in the work that we do, which is so rare, honestly. So he had a history of commissioning works for both individuals and also for groups. And so I met him, early when I moved to Toronto through a mutual friend, and he and I hit it off, and he wanted to commission somebody to write a solo work for me. And at that point, I guess this was 2012 at that point, because I think I premiered the piece in 2013. And so at that point, my first thought was Michael Osterly. And I moved to Canada in 2010, and I had heard a few pieces of Michael's before then. But I really got to know his work, having moved here and having seen, I think I saw Array do a piece of his before I was playing with the ensemble. In my first couple of years here, I worked with Michael with the Evergreen Club Contemporary Gamelan. He did a piece for them that I played on, and I really enjoyed his music. And then I met him at the Gamelan gig, and he and I got along well. And so he was the first person I thought of. So the original, the original idea was, your usual 10 to 12 minute piece of contemporary music. And as you know, it quickly spiraled out of control. So yeah, that was the genesis of the piece. And Michael really wanted to, he was interested in the similar things that I was interested in at the time. And I think that's why the piece ended up being what it was, is that he and I were, like I said, we were kind of in similar places artistically at that point, musically. Like, we both wanted, the kind of music that he was interested in writing was also the kind of music that I was interested in playing at that point. And so I think it just kind of, he was enjoying it, and it just kind of, he set himself this problem with the piece, and I think he was enjoying figuring out how to solve it. And 51 minutes later, there we are. So yeah, that's how the piece came together. It was very organic, but it really was, Daniel has to be credited so strongly with the piece existing, and then what really amazing, Daniel went on to have unfortunately Daniel passed away a couple of years ago now, but he commissioned several other works from Michael. He supported Michael very strongly over the last few years of his life, and I know Michael, really credits Daniel with a lot of the pieces he was able to write, in maybe the last 5-7 years.
Well, so, congratulations! It was a great commission. It was great that you were able to convince Michael to come on board for it as well. I guess when you got the music and saw it for the first time, were you a bit surprised? Or was it exactly what you were expecting?
Well, um, I wasn't surprised because Michael and I were in touch throughout the whole time. So he had tipped me off as to what I was up against. You know what I mean? And the score didn't come whole. You know, the score, I didn't get all five movements,
Yeah.
all movements at once. It came, I think I might have gotten six first. Do you know what I mean? He ended up revising six, and so he actually scrapped the original version of six. But that one came early. I think one came pretty early. Like, so they didn't come in order, and they didn't come whole. So I wasn't surprised, but only because he and I were in touch pretty regularly throughout the process.
Yeah.
So yeah. That's
I,
otherwise I'm sure I would have been.
Well, from my perspective, I was introduced to the piece through your recording. So I had a pretty preconceived notion of how it would look on paper.
Yeah.
And then when I saw the actual, that open score, which I love, I mean, it was fantastic to work through it, but it was, you get these preconceived ideas, and then how am I going to break this down, and how am I going to sort of rethink it? Because you come from a completely different space.
Yeah, and I love listening to your recording because it's so familiar and yet so not at the same time.
I'm sorry about that.
No, I love it. It's so interesting to hear, and it's so interesting to hear it with the two versions of the piece, like what's very different and what stays the same at the same time. I saw the first version of six first, which was very different. He scrapped six entirely, and so I didn't see that one until much later. So yeah, so I didn't get the layered polyrhythm thing right off the bat.
Right. And so, but that was my introduction to SpanningTree. So it got happier as I went on. So when you approach things like these layered polyrhythms and nested, how did you approach actually working with the music itself? Do you have any like techniques to help guide you through it?
Well, there's a fair bit of math to get the thing, try to get everything lined up. Michael is pretty accurate on how he spaces it on the page, so he's the music is more or less right in how close the third note of a quintuplet is to the sixth note of a septuplet. So it's spaced out pretty accurately. So but I think I'm not going to be able to explain any better than to refer people to Steve Schick's article about learning Fernie Howe's bone alphabet.
Yep.
Where he talks about how you tend, like when you're trying to learn these things on top of each other, you tend to foreground one thing and play something else against one thing, against that thing. And that's certainly how I learned that movement of SpanningTree. I expect that if you really worked it out with me, if I actually played it correctly the way I kind of hear it, you would find that one of the rhythms is very accurate, and the other rhythm is a much more approximated in relation to the one that's accurate.
I understand.
That makes sense. So I will tend to hold the one rhythm in my head, and the other rhythm will be, I will be attempting to play it mathematically correctly, but more likely will we fit into that first one.
It's really interesting.
If that makes sense.
It does. Mine was, I completely rewrote it.
Yeah, I hope you put that up because I haven't seen your rewrite.
I will. So you wouldn't recognize the two. There's only a few little places. There's one where you lap upon yourself. Gung, ging, gung, ging, gung, 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 gung. That thing that you actually see on the page. Everything else is in a 6/4, 5/4, whatever. I will definitely put it up. It's just fun. I had to think like that. Typical timpanist.
That's right.
You
That's
know?
right. I hadn't thought about that distinction. I haven't played too many since graduate school, so yeah.
So few choices, all of them wrong. Not you in graduate school, I mean timpani. So,
No, that's very funny.
yeah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think, yeah, I think the way, I mean, everyone approaches these things differently, and that's the way it worked for me. Um, I've done pieces in that vein before, and things like that. And that's how I've sort of always found myself doing it. And for me, I'm a very, very physical muscle memory oriented player in everything I do.
Yep.
And in things like that, muscle memory takes over very strongly. The more complex the things, the more complex the notation and things like that, the more I tend to remember it in my body rather than you know rather than sort of reading it, if you will, on the page.
Absolutely. I'll throw up some pictures of the setup for 6. Mine
Mhm.
is, I actually set it up more chromatically, like an octave.
Yeah. So now, interestingly, that's one piece where your setup and my setup are really quite similar.
Okay.
You lay your instruments out differently,
Yeah.
but the instrument choices are not so different.
Yes, I'm going to thank you for that one. Thank you.
Oh, okay, good. So for me, I do that. My conception of that one was this little constellation. Like I use all this little tiny stuff,
Yep.
tiny, and that's the one. Where I'm making. For me, I'm making. That's one's a little bit different as far as the way I'm choosing instruments than in the rest of the piece.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only one where I pick different instruments for each group. What struck me about your instrument decisions, which were different than mine, is like I think I love your attention to each individual sound having its own character. Which is different. I tended to think of them, I think, in more often in groups. So like I wanted sort of all of the short sounds in one movement to be the same thing, and all of the long sounds in one movement to be the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that they both could be melodies. But sort of the result of that, when I do like that too. The result of that is sometimes the individual instruments, I think, get flattened,
Mm-hmm.
where there's a little bit less like, oh, this particular little thing is really a beautiful sound,
Yes. Like the little piccolo tempo block.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and like going
special.
The only time I do that in is 6,
Yeah.
But where you do it a bit more spread out throughout the piece, and I like. It's a very sort of, I love the sort of percussion materials element of
Yeah.
Where each sound can be this like little gem on its own, that rings or doesn't, whether it's short or long, whereas I tended to, I was trying to make like melodic connections between the instrument groups, and mostly I think it's successful. But you lose those little tiny little character things from each individual little joyous sound.
I do think that your approach is a little, I think it might be closer to what Michael is after to an extent too, because your collection of the sameness sometimes within groups creates this whole other sound. So it becomes far more than 5 flower pots. There's something else that emerges that's I find really special, and it fits in kind of with. I don't want to put words in Michael's mouth either, but it fits in with his aesthetic to an extent. There is this greatness that comes from some of those parts, and so I find that very interesting when I listen. How it creates this super instrument.
Yeah, and and I had, like I said, I mean, obviously, I had the advantage of talking to him a lot while he was writing it, so yeah, he thinks that, for him, I think the piece was a lot about counterpoint, really different versions of counterpoint, very, very sort of as a pure composition exercise, counterpoint. And, sustained and not, and tempos, and like these very sort of, relatively simple elements, and how many different ways can you combine them and do different things with them,
Right.
yeah.
How did you treat the duration of the long tones? For example, the long tones, when I looked at developing the work, I was thinking along the lines of durations, but with taper. For example, in a movement like number 4, when I used a shorter duration were actually tom-tom sounds, whereas the longer ones, they were cymbals. So I would try to muffle off the cymbal at the end of durations with the sticks, whereas yours were, I felt, really well-defined ends. The sound would start and the sound would stop in some of these instances, especially the ones with slower tempos and longer durations.
Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with how Michael writes it. And this was a game, I think I told you about this when we spoke on the phone. This was a game that Michael was playing with himself. He had very clear ideas, or at least sort of some strong ideas about what he was imagining when he wrote these pieces, what instruments he was imagining when he wrote these pieces. But he didn't tell me that. He told me he had ideas, but he didn't tell me what they were. So the game, the sort of exercise for him was to see how much he can, I'm putting a little bit of words in his mouth, but to see how much he can control my instrumentation choices by the way he wrote the score.
Okay.
So if you look carefully at the score, as I know you have, each movement is notated somewhat differently. So there are a couple movements where the long notes are clearly notated with like an attack note, and then a lasse vibre indication. Like you would see with like a cymbal crash in an orchestra. Whereas in other movements of 4 in particular, you have whole notes that are tied together, and it looks like like you're blowing through. To me, it looked like organ music.
Yep.
And so those two different ways of writing sustained tones really shaped the way I chose the instruments. Mm-hmm. So like in 3, where he's got, like in number 3, where he's got the short sounds on top and the long sounds on the bottom, but they're all beamed together because you're playing a single rhythm between the 3 of them, between them, and just that the bottom ones ring and the top ones don't. Those to me sort of seemed like your regular, something that you strike and rings, and then you don't worry about dampening or shutting it down. Whereas 4 is the one that looked like organ music to me, and he's got whole notes, like dyad whole notes tied together over like 8 beats. It doesn't look to me like it's supposed to decay. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I was trying to think of a way to sort of mimic an organ sort of thing. And what I ended up settling on was I found this iPad harmonium app that with like a little keyboard on the iPad and this just intonation harmonium sound. And so I could literally play an imaginary little organ with one hand and then play. And I used tom-toms for that one as well, for that one. Yeah. And that solved that problem for me. So it's interesting to me how the choices in movement order are so drastically affected by your choices in instruments too. When you make different instrument choices and the piece which changes some of the character of each of those movements, then it might change the decisions you would choose as to where you put them.
Absolutely. 5 is a really interesting example. I started doing the same idea you had, you accomplished with, I think it was flower pots, right?
Yeah. 5 is, I'm unhappy with my 5, remain unhappy with my 5. The 5 is the work in progress for me. And it's 5 is kind of the 5 has been one of the things that one of my unsolved problems in that piece. So yeah, I did flower pots, and then mostly like sort of wooden planks, like very clanky kind of wooden
Yeah, yeah.
planks, and a couple drums, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But the flower pots were the ringing, were the sustained ones.
Right. And it sounds great. It really sounds great. I tried working with those. Then I tried working with a gamelan kind of setup. I
Mm-hmm.
tried working with Turkish cymbals. I just completely whacked myself in the head and went back to boobams. Tried those. All horrible failures for me. So I started working on Cha Cha Cha, the Paul Rivers piece.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's why I've got a.
That's an interesting. Yeah, of course. No, I like the Wiro. I like your choices on that one. And I never thought of a Wiro for any of that, for any of those things, for any of the movements. But yeah, I like your five a lot, and I've been unhappy with mine. Like I said, I've got some ideas of how I do want to do it, but it involves multiple foot pedals and building some kind of small rack to hang things.
Tempos. Michael writes a great range of tempos, but the real challenge, I think, are on the slow tempos, like quarter note or pulse equals 30. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that part of it.
So yeah, I think the very slow tempos are crucial, actually crucial. And and what I love about the piece as a whole is how incredibly systematic and process driven it is, and how clear Michael's process is throughout that whole thing. So, he's got I don't remember. I don't. So he's got the two in two, for instance. That's the one that goes down. It goes way down and then back up. Yeah. So he'll have tempos at 60 and at 30 and then at 90 and then one, things that are multiples of each other, and then stuff in between. Honestly, I'm not sure how accurate I mean, when I learned the piece I did it with the metronome, and I know that these days, and I haven't done the whole piece since I did it at Array, but I've done 3 and 2 as a pair a lot. So I've done 2 a great deal by itself, and dealing with this problem. So in that one specifically, I don't think I don't know how accurate I am now, but I think it's probably just as effective as it was when I was being very rigorous about it. It's very obvious to say that you have to move in time to play percussion in time. But like when it comes down to actually doing it, I think it's sometimes harder than it sort of sounds, So if I'm playing something it's at 30, I'm likely to be moving the whole time. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And moving. So I want to back up a little bit with the camera and imagine. So like in 2, I've got the bells hung and the brake drum sitting here, and I do a lot of, that sort of thing. Like I sort of feel like you have to show the audience the slow tempos as much as you have to play the slow tempos.
That is something I struggled with. I put a metronome on. I think it was 6. I just wanted to check where I was. Well, I was in another city. That's where I was.
It's terrifying. It's terrifying when you actually turn it on.
Oh, it was just an awful experience. I had convinced myself I had invented a completely new Western time. So that was an eye opener. And I spent a few more days with that happy little metronome. And even so, when I come back to it, hopefully on the sooner side, that it'll all be different.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to playing it live, actually.
Yeah, I find that the slow movements really really come alive
Live.
live.
Yeah.
You know, it's there's something about having the audience in front of you, and I've discovered that when I have an audience in front of me, the way I tend to push things to greater extremes than I would without an audience. And I've found, part of it is that, in 4, for instance, that one's being so long, and going back to the order, I put it right in the middle.
Yep.
I kind of think of the piece as an arch form, and I do 1, 6,
Right.
3, 4, 5, 5, 2.
Also, do you know if anyone else is tackling this piece or has of any other?
Not that I know of. No one has. Yeah, I haven't heard about it. Yeah, I heard when you were doing it a couple years ago, but I haven't heard about it since. It's so magical, and it's such a masterpiece for our instrument. I love it so much.
Yeah. And when we get back into the halls, we can really appreciate it again. We have an audience. It's something that is so far beyond the sum of the parts.
It really is, and that's the comment I got a lot when I for both of I played it twice in its full length live, and I that was the comment I got both times, was that it really is a journey, and that the individual movements are great and they work, but there's something about sitting through the whole thing, and that's kind of why I really like 4 at that sort of midpoint, because they've gotten sort of this long, and to me, like somewhere around the middle of the piece, and for me it's in 4 where they're like, they're stuck listening to this like organ fourths and fifths for like 18 minutes. Like there's something in there that really, like, it's like one of the long Feldman pieces where you just at some point like you can feel the audience getting sort of tense and a little squirmy, and then at a certain point it's like you feel them accept their fate. and then the whole rest of the piece you've got them. But yeah, it's such a magical piece. I adore it.
Fabulous. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about it. But it's been a real pleasure seeing you, real pleasure talking with you. And look forward to the next time SpanningTree emerges from Toronto.
I will let you know. And if you hear of anyone else playing it, please tell me.
Ditto. That'd be fantastic. Thanks so much.